In today's lesson, we're answering the question, how did Enlightenment principles affect American independence and government? And so we're going to have a chance to look at the factors that inspired the American colonists to revolt against the English monarchy that controlled them. So our big goal today is to learn about the American Revolution. And in order to do that, we first will need to explain how the Enlightenment is going to influence the American colonies, these Enlightenment ideals about government and social order. We're also going to have to examine primary source documents to understand kind of how everything developed during this time. And then finally, we'll be able to describe the impact of the revolution around the world. The American Revolution is actually going to inspire revolutions in other parts of the world. Now, from here, we're going to have an opportunity to look at some of the key words in this lesson. So take a moment to look at these words. At any time as they come up throughout the lesson, you can click on the word to give yourself a refresher on the definition and its context. How did the Enlightenment principles affect American independence and government? In today's lesson, we're going to have a chance to explore how the Enlightenment is going to influence and inspire American colonists to revolt against the English crown. We're also going to have a chance to explore how the American Revolution is going to influence other revolutions around the world, and the spread of these kind of Enlightenment ideas is going to continue. Now that we have an idea of kind of what we're going to study, we're going to move forward to examine kind of how the old system of government compares to the new system of government. Ultimately, the Enlightenment is going to change the way people think about government. And some of these Enlightenment ideas are going to really influence the American Revolution. These ideas include this concept of natural rights. First introduced by John Locke, this is the idea that we have God-given rights that no government or single person could take away from us. This idea that a social contract, first introduced by Thomas Hobbes, this is the idea that there is a contract between people and government and they have to work in cooperation with one another. This concept of popular sovereignty we'll talk about in this lesson, the idea that government has to work at the will or the consent of the people. And then finally, we'll explore this idea of a separation of powers, the idea that government should not be in the hands of one person or one entity, that all of these powers need to balance each other out. Now let's take a look at how all of these ideas combine to lead to the revolution in America against British rule. So we've had a chance to review and explore some of the Enlightenment ideas that really inspired the American Revolution. And so in this lesson, as we answer the question, how did Enlightenment principles affect American independence and government, it's important to look at two of the early documents that really enforce these ideals in America. So we're going to start off with the Declaration of Independence, which we see in the foreground on the screen here. Now, the Declaration of Independence is what really propels America forward into a revolution against British rule. So let's take a look further at this document and see kind of how all of this unfolds. So by the 1700s, the colonists in America are growing increasingly resentful of British policies. And this is for a few reasons. They feel that they aren't accurately represented in the British government. They have no right to vote for members of Parliament. So they have no say in the laws that Parliament are passing, particularly the laws related to taxes. Now, Britain is continually raising the colonists' taxes in order to pay off debts. Now, these debts are caused by wars that Britain imposes in the Americas, particularly the French and Indian War, in which Britain forces France out of the Americas. Now, all of this combines with enforcement of very strict trade policies. These rules kind of govern who the colonies are allowed to trade with, and thus it's really restricting the amount of money that the colonies are able to bring in on their own. So all of these things combine to encourage the colonists to start taking action against British rule. So colonists felt that ultimately their rights and their liberties were being violated by the British Parliament and monarchy. And so they begin to protest British policies, sometimes violently, like in the form of tarring and feathering, in the Boston Tea Party, for example. And as a result, and we'll make sure we remember, the Boston Tea Party was one of these major turning points in this conflict between the Americans and the British. And so as a result of some of these kind of movements towards a revolution, Britain begins to pass new laws to punish the colonists. New taxes, particularly, are levied against the colonists. And so as a result, many colonists begin to call for independence. And this is really going to start sowing the seeds for that revolution. So let's take a look at what we've learned so far. Now, Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers of America, is one of the primary authors of the Declaration of Independence. And in this declaration, he affirms what he believes in as natural rights of all people, and he demonstrates in this declaration that Britain breaks the social contract that consents government between people and government. Now, he believes in popular sovereignty, this concept that government can only work with the will of the people, the consent of the majority. Now, let's take a look at how the Declaration kind of outlines some of these ideas. Now, as we read this excerpt, consider the influences of those Enlightenment principles on this document. In the Declaration written in 1776, we see that we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. Now, let's consider these Enlightenment principles that we can see in the excerpt here. This concept that certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, this comes directly from that concept of natural rights as introduced by John Locke. We also see John Locke's influence in the part here where it says, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. And so whenever that social contract is broken, we have the right to form a new government. Now, the publishing of this declaration is going to be the key component in encouraging this revolution against British rule. Now, following the Declaration of Independence, Britain is viewing this as an act of rebellion. And as a result, they decide to send an army to force the revolutionaries to surrender. This is going to immediately lead to a conflict that lasts for 5 years. Now, after 5 years of war, the Americans were able to force a British surrender, and in the painting that we see on the screen, we see a commemoration of George Washington forcing General Cornwallis to surrender. How did Enlightenment principles affect American independence and government? So we've had a chance to learn that Enlightenment principles are going to influence this Declaration of Independence, which is signed in 1776. And following 5 years of war against British rule, we finally see the Americans come out on top, and they have to establish a new form of government. Now, in the background of the image on the screen here, we see those opening lines of the American Constitution, "We the people." And what we're going to do now is take a look at how the Constitution really enforces those principles of independence in American government. So American independence follows the Revolution, and a new form of government starts in 1787 when American leaders meet in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. Now, the form of government that they had tried previously, the Articles of Confederation, proved to be weak because of a lack of centralized government. And so these American leaders that are coming together to create this new form of government, they realize that they need a stronger centralized government, but they're also afraid of the threat of tyranny or dictatorship. And so when they come together to write this new Constitution, they're very much aware that they need to create this kind of balance of power. And so let's look at how they're able to balance this power so that it doesn't go too much, it doesn't concentrate too much in one person or one entity's hands. Now, the United States Constitution is going to really rely on these Enlightenment influences. So the thinkers like John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, Baron de Montesquieu, those are going to influence the Constitution just as they had in the Declaration of Independence. But it's really the English Bill of Rights that we see heavily influencing the Constitution. So let's take a look at some of those influences. Now, the English Bill of Rights is written nearly 100 years before the American Constitution, and we see that a lot of these influences are going to kind of take from the English Bill of Rights. The limited power of government that we see introduced by the English Bill of Rights in the form of limiting the power of the executive, or in England's case, the monarchy, by providing a certain amount of power to Parliament. Parliament is an elected body. So these free and fair elections of Parliament to balance the power of the monarchy are going to influence the way we balance that power between Congress and the President in our Constitution. Okay. Now, some of the rights that are outlined in the English Bill of Rights we see here in the freedom of speech, the right to bear arms, the right to a fair trial, and the belief that no one should be under cruel or unusual punishment by law. Now, all of these are included in the American Bill of Rights, those first 10 amendments to the American Constitution. So let's take a moment to review what we've learned so far. So we know that the English Bill of Rights is going to be particularly influential in creating the American Constitution, but so are all of these ideas from Enlightenment thinkers coming together, particularly the ideas of John Locke, the Baron de Montesquieu, and Voltaire. Now, John Locke introduces this idea of popular sovereignty, governing with people's consent. So we'll just make sure we remember this concept of popular sovereignty. Now, like the Baron de Montesquieu, John Locke believes in a limited power of government, and Montesquieu is going to kind of take that idea a step further by introducing these ideas of a separation of power and checks and balances between multiple government entities. Now, in the American system of government, this results in those three branches of government that we have today. So we've got the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch all balancing each other out. And finally, some of these ideas that come from Voltaire, these ideas of freedom of religion, the separation of church and state, and the freedom of the press are going to be outlined in our Bill of Rights. Now, the American Revolution is going to have an impact around the globe. The Declaration of Independence and the revolution that followed it is actually going to inspire the French Revolution and the French people to sign their own Declaration of the Rights of Man and to abandon the monarchy that had existed for centuries previously. Now, the success that America sees is going to encourage other colonies to declare independence, particularly in the Caribbean and other parts of the Americas. And this is because the U.S. Constitution provides this model of something called a representative democracy. Now let's take a look at how all of these events kind of transpire on a timeline. So the American Revolution occurs between 1775 and 1783, and just a year or so after the American Revolution really begins, the Declaration of Independence is adopted in 1776. Now, just a little over 10 years later, the U.S. Constitution is ratified or agreed upon by all the states in the U.S. Now, if we compare what's happening over the course of the American Revolution to what's happening in other parts of the world, we see that a lot of events are kind of preceding this revolution. First of all, we know that the Baron de Montesquieu publishes The Spirit of Laws in 1748, this idea of a separation of powers between the government and checks and balances, those influences to the American government. But some Enlightenment ideas actually went much beyond, or started much earlier than 1748. Actually, as early as the 1600s, a lot of these Enlightenment ideas are developing. Now, in Europe, the 7 Years' War ends in 1763, and not that long after, England finds itself at war again during the American Revolution. And so we can see that England is going to kind of have its hands full as a result of all these wars that it's fighting in a pretty short period of time. Now, following the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, and the signing of the U.S. Constitution, we see all of this inspiring the French, and in 1789, the French Revolution begins.